my great fortune to connect with him at the first Tikkun conference that we had in 1988, and there to recognize a kindred soul. And we became closer and closer, and eventually we ended up writing a book together called Blacks and Jews, Let the Healing Begin. And it was, for me, a tremendous healing process, and just to know know Cornel West. It's an amazing thing to be able to be part of a community that has this kind of wisdom and this kind of leadership and this kind of depth. Cornel is about to celebrate his 50th birthday, and that's part of the reason why he's going to be with his family, and the birthday is on Tuesday. So after his talk, we're going to certainly take a moment or two to sing happy birthday to him. But before we go there, we're going to welcome Cornel and say thank you, Cornel, for being with us.
Blessing to be here. I'd like to pay tribute to each and every one of you for having the wise judgment to coming together, because this moment is a crucial one. It's a very crucial one, and we know what we're talking about is so much bigger than each and every one of us. I'd like to first begin by really just expressing my deep love and respect for Brother Lerner. Michael Lerner is a close companion of mine now for 15 years, and I can recall the precious moments in which with his son, his wonderful son Akiba, in Berkeley there, wrestling with issues, disagreeing, agreeing to disagree, ending up agreeing when we didn't think we would agree, and yet at the same time keeping our focus on a vision that was luring us in ways that was unpredictable. You see, that's in part what Tikkun community is all about. We were able to experience that for 15 years. So I want to pay tribute to my dear brother, Michael Lerner. I knew him before he was a rabbi, so I've got to begin to add that in. Brother Rabbi Michael Lerner. We're so very thankful for Sister Deborah Corey. She does such a wonderful job. She's not just intelligence and energy, but such candor and honesty. Each time she speaks, she, like Ray Charles, just put her soul right on the table, you know, and allow you to revel in it. Let's give her a hand as well. No, I'm talking about soul, though. We got Sister Consuela Luz from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and her singing, expressing not only her soul, but her deep conviction and commitment, because we in Tikkun community do not believe that art is ornamental and decorative. It's constitutive of what we are and what we're all about. They're not marginal, external. They're internal and fundamentally a part of who and what we are. And of course, last but not least is our dear prophetic figure and Dartmouth professor and comrade, Sister Susanna Heschel, who was our co-chair. She's still sitting there. Because for me, when we talk about the state of the spirit 2003, we're talking in part about the underdeveloped status of three particular forms of spirituality: Socratic spirituality, prophetic spirituality, and democratic spirituality. And one of the reasons why we're dealing with such dark and bleak times is precisely because we don't have enough Socratic spirituality. We don't have enough courage for people to think critically. And we're not just talking about narrow forms of intelligence. We're talking about intellect, narrow forms of intelligence, manipulative faculty, evaluating an immediate situation. Intellect, it has to do with a creative, critical, contemplative faculty that evaluates the evaluations in light of a larger whole. And we want to affirm the role of the intellect in the Tikkun community, which is a subversive act in American civilization. Really is. But we begin with ourselves, not in the spirit of self-righteousness of attacking others, We begin by examining ourselves. What are the ways in which we have been shaped and molded by the prevailing assumptions and presuppositions such that we are often blinded by, beclouded by, not just prejudice and bigotry, but mainstream opinion. You see? To be Socratic is to do what? To ask the most painful questions about oneself, one's society, and the world. And we come together in part because we're willing to make that leap. We're willing to say, yes, we will view ourselves as an object of investigation, our community, our society, our world, which means what? We're willing to pierce through the vicious forms of mendacity and hypocrisy and falsity about ourselves, our community, our society, and the world. So by the time we get to the George Bush of the world, we've already worked from ourselves to George Bush, so we do it with righteous indignation. Because it's not self-righteous. And that's very important. Very important. Socratic spirituality says what? The condition of truth is to allow the free play of critical intelligence. The Greeks call nous. And to take that quest seriously means you already are cutting against the grain in a commercialized, commodified world, commercialized and commodified media, commercialized and commodified educational system, and so forth. And to create some space where we can all come together and say, let's see what some of the results are of the critical intelligence you have exercised in your context. Now, granted, I come from a particular tradition, and given all the talk about the ecumenical and all the talk about the universal, which I want to affirm, I also want to acknowledge specificity. I am a blues person. I say that unashamedly. I come from a particular tradition and people and heritage that has had to engage in a sad but sweet indictment of misery by being Socratic. That's what the blues is. It raised questions, dogmas like white supremacy that most of the larger society didn't want to interrogate. America's unsocratic when it came to the dogma of white supremacy. And what were the blues saying? We're going to begin with the unexamined dogma of this civilization and create an art form by engaging in some sweet, sad indictment of its effects and consequences. That's the whence that I flow from. And we all have our particular contexts and whences. There's a blues man called Tennessee Williams, born in Columbus, Mississippi. He also is engaged in his sweet and sad indictment of misery in light of his attempt to come to terms with his Southern context, his gay orientation, his anarchist sensibility, and his genius, like his fellow Mississippian Muddy Waters, or Robert Johnson, or William Faulkner. There's a prophetic Judaic tradition. Amos, Micah, Isaiah, Abraham, Joshua, Heschel, Susanna Heschel, Beatrice Magdoff. Rich, deep. There's the Irish tradition of Eugene O'Neill. Isn't that blues shot through? Long day's journey into the funk, into the night, into the darkness, raising fundamental questions. He says about America what? This nation suffers from the belief that it can possess its soul by means of possessing commodities. It's the greatest tragedy of human history, precisely because it believes it can conquer the world and not in the process lose its soul. That's 1914 of that great Irish blues man in his context, learning from other contexts. So when we talk about Socratic spirituality and Tikkun community, we're talking about becoming multi-contextual, but seeing where we overlap and intertwine in light of our willingness to exercise our critical intelligence. and then connect it to prophetic spirituality, which says what? The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak. The condition of truth is to allow misery to become visible and pain to be heard. And that's a crucial move because it talks about the courage to love, and we've heard some very deep, wise words this afternoon about the courage to love, the courage to exercise compassion, not just talk about it, but to try to enact it, knowing we will do it inadequately, but attempting to do it anyway. In my own particular tradition, I think one of the greatest moments in American culture occurred in August 1955 when Emmett Till's body was brought back to Chicago and Pilgrim Baptist Church. Reverend Julius Caesar Austin stepped to the lectern and introduced a woman named Moms Till Mabley, who was the mother of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a victim of American terrorism called Jim Crow. In Mississippi, lynching, murder, mayhem. Not even having a chance to sing the blues, having to live the blues in the form of what? Terroristic attack. Terrorism is not new to America. Internal terrorism. And what did she do when she stepped to that lectern? She looked over and saw her babies. His head was 4 times the size of his normal head. She looked in the audience. And she says, I don't have a minute to hate. I'm going to pursue justice for the rest of my life. That's a level of spiritual maturity and moral maturity that's connected to Socratic and prophetic spirituality. What a response to terrorism. What a response to misery. What a response to oppression. What a response to domination. Don't have a minute to hate. Going to pursue justice for the rest of her life. And she died just a few months ago with justice on her lips. Let's give her a hand. Let's give her justice on her lips. And what was she but? One crucial voice in a long tradition. You could hear John Coltrane's A Love Supreme in the background. You could see Martin Luther King Jr.'s beloved community in the future. You could see Marvin Gaye playing the piano, maybe a little high, flying in friendly skies, but still sounding so good in what's going on. What? A courage to love, and connecting a courage to think critically with a courage to love from a particular people who have been so hated and haunted and hunted down like dogs. That's the roots that constitutes the launching pad for our universality. To dig deep enough in our own traditions, in our own families, our own heritages, our own backgrounds, knowing that there's some ugly things there in each context, but there's something valuable and precious enough to elevate us in such a way that we could connect in our humanity, even as we acknowledge that our humanity is embodied in specific bodies and traditions and heritages and families and religious orientations and ideological formations and so forth. What a grand example. And last but not least, this democratic spirituality. You see in democratic vistas of old Walt Whitman, better even in his Leaves of Grass, Ralph Emerson at his best exemplifies. Louis Armstrong, Aaron Copland, Leonard Bernstein, Billy Wilder, all of these attempts to do what? Accent that spirituality that says that the condition of the good society is to lift every voice, as the Negro National Anthem says, such that we can play a role in shaping our destiny, allowing that every voice, no matter what color, what gender, what sexual orientation, what class, what region, plays a role in the decision-making processes in those institutions that guide and regulate our lives. What a grand vision. What a grand vision it is, no doubt. John Dewey,
Early Sidney Hook. Changed his mind later.
This democratic creed. And my suggestion is that we're living at a time, the age of the American empire. Age of the American empire. Nothing like it in human history. More scope, depth, breadth than the British Empire at its height and the Roman Empire at its zenith. And we have to come to terms with this. Not just troops in over 100 nations, bases in over 70 nations, the defense budget larger than all 20 countries following it put together. Not just engaging in a new doctrine of preemptive strike. No, Brother Noam Chomsky is right. It's preventive war. It's more radical than that. You don't even need an ominous possibility of attack. If you decide that they have the potential to think about challenging you, you can invade their nation. This is unprecedented international relations. It's a new norm. It's a sign of not just imperial arrogance and hubris, but it's an attempt to actually think that you can shape the whole world in your own image. You see, this is new. We've had imperialism before. Cuba, Philippines, Hawaii. We've had imperialism before.
Moving borders of Mexico. Texas, California, used to be Mexico.
We've had imperialism before. Ask our indigenous brothers and sisters, our dear red brothers and sisters will tell you about imperial invasion and violation of treaty and preemptive strike. We're living in a different age. Why? It's hard to discern some countervailing forces. The vicious Soviet empire that repressed and regimented its population is gone. 12 years gone. And the new imperialists here in this chocolate city in the White House. Because D.C. is a chocolate city, isn't it?
Yeah. Yep.
Well, we're 65% black folk.
But the new imperialists in the White House.
And their vision, which includes some black folk, you know, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, they're part of the American imperial machine. Black folk are proud of them for achieving, but achieving for what? For what aim? For what end? Are you going to facilitate a situation in which the three pillars of the American empire remain uninterrogated? What are those three pillars? First, free market fundamentalism. We're all talking about Islamic fundamentalism, Christian fundamentalism, Judaic fundamentalism. Socratic spirituality is suspicious of all forms of fundamentalism that reduce forms of complexity. No doubt about that. But there's free market fundamentalism. You privatize, marketize, commodify, commercialize your way out of all problems. The market is idle. Worshipping the market, which is but a legal and human construction. And the result is what? Escalating wealth inequality. 1% of the population own now 48% of the net financial wealth, 5% own 70%, and that's before the tax cut. That's before the tax cut. And the result is what? The most vulnerable, beginning with the children of all colors, taking the hits. Then the poor, disproportionately women and children. Disproportionately black and brown, but numerically more white than black and brown. Working people, just commodities to be bought and sold, downsized as if they're simply units or entities rather than human beings. Healthcare, education, arts and education pushed to the margins. What kind of Socratic, prophetic, and democratic spirituality can be sustained in light? There not being enough citizens who want to interrogate. Right? That pillar, free market fundamentalism. Under the Bush administration, it becomes even quite clear that oftentimes they're unwilling even to legitimate what they're doing. It just acts of raw power. crony capitalism. My friends, no need to bid. No, we lied about weapons of destruction. Sorry about that, but you knew we did anyway. We had a plan that we were going to follow through no matter what the evidence said. Such disrespect for citizenship. Such disrespect for democratic processes, for rule of law. That link of free market fundamentalism with that kind of aggressive militarism. And it's a working class army for the most part. I remind my Princeton students of that, walking around talking about how wonderful the war was and is. I said, I've got cousins in the army, do you? 48% of the women were black women. I've got cousins in the army, 12 of them. When I oppose the war, I also are deeply concerned about their lives just as precious as any other soldier's life. Each life a human life on both sides. On both sides. Then that aggressive militarism inseparable from the escalating authoritarianism, the Patriotic Act #1. There's a Patriotic Act #2. I'm sure many of you heard about the so-called Domestic Security Enhancement Act that tightens up Patriotic Act #1, which means that sisters like Susanna Hessel-Dorth, Deborah Corey, and brothers like Michael Lerner and myself, we could easily end up spending some wonderful time in jail together. 4, 5, 10, 15 years from now by holding this kind of conference if any of you are surreptitiously connected to whoever the government characterizes as terrorists. Well, you spent that wonderful afternoon together engaging in all that rhetoric. I know you made some association with Brother Weston Lerner who's connected with some terrorists down in Guatemala and Argentina, the Middle East. Really? Don't need evidence, don't need to adduce evidence. We already know what it is and we will not release it. Why? Because we are the government. The most anti-democratic characterization you can make in which rule of law is flaunted, held at such arm's length. This is the moment in which we come together, you all. This is the moment in which we come together. And all of our talk about being connected and linked and so forth is so important and so significant. And yet we also know those who Frantz Fanon called the wretched of the earth, of our brothers and sisters in the Middle East, be they Israeli, Palestinian, Iraqi, Syrian, Egyptian, in Asia, be they Pakistani, Indian, be they in Japan or China, be they in Guatemala, their life has the same value as our life. And we affirm that explicitly. And that's the general principle that we bring to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We say explicitly, we love the Israeli people, we love the Palestinian people, we love them so much that we're going to bring our Socratic, prophetic, and democratic sensibility to bear in our resolutions. And that will acknowledge a U.S. government that has such tremendous difficulty really believing that a Palestinian life has exactly the same value as an Israeli life. And we'll say it openly in the name of the prophetic ideals that come out of the legacy of Jerusalem, of Amos and Micah and Jesus and Mohammed, that the secular ideologues can manipulate in their own ways to generate other ways of talking about justice, but they know they're parasitic in so many ways on that rich prophetic legacy of Jerusalem that weds the best of the Judaic, the Christian, and the Islamic, even as it holds at arm's length and looks at the vicious elements of the worst of Judaism, the worst of Christianity, and the worst of Islam. That's in part what the Tikkun community is about. We're so very glad to be here. Thank you all so much for acknowledging my birthday tomorrow, but that's not important because there's no other place I would be my last year in my last day in my 40s than with the Tikkun community. I tell you all that.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Cornel.